Hello, everybody, and welcome to Morbid Mads. Now, you may have noticed if you clicked on my channel that it's been a long time since I posted a video here, and in my last video, I did in fact promise that this video would be in just a couple of months. It has been a little over a year, so my apologies in that regard, but I am back and hoping to stick to a much better update schedule, and I am finally here with part one of the Survivors of the Impossible Iceberg. Now, my preview video, if you happen to watch that one, does include two of the first entries on here. So, if you've already seen that video, you can skip to this timestamp that's on screen right now. Otherwise, sit back, relax, and get ready for layer one of the Survivors of the Impossible Iceberg.
Aaron Ralston. In 2003, Aaron Ralston, a now 48-year-old mountaineer, was canyoneering in Blue John Canyon in Utah. It was a solo trip, and he hadn't told anyone he was going on it. While he was descending the lower stretches of the Slot Canyon, a suspended 800-pound boulder dislodged while he was climbing down from it. As it fell, it first smashed his left hand and then crushed his right hand against the canyon wall, effectively trapping him miles from civilization, unable to call for help. For days, Ralston stayed trapped, slowly sipping the water he had with him and eating the 2 burritos he had packed. By the 5th day, Ralston had resorted to drinking his own urine and even carved his name and birth date and what he presumed his date of death to be into the wall, so that whoever found his body would know who he was. He videotaped his last goodbyes to his family and did not expect to survive the night.
My name's Aaron Ralston. My parents are Donna and Larry Ralston of Englewood, Colorado. Whoever finds this, please make an attempt to get it to them. Be sure of it. I would appreciate it.
But as he attempted to stay warm, he began hallucinating and had a vision of himself playing with a future child while missing part of his right arm. Ralston later credited this as giving him the belief that he would live. When he awoke the next morning, he discovered that his right arm had begun to decompose from the lack of blood flow. He realized the only way to escape would be to cut it off, so he began the excruciating process of amputating his forearm with a knife and pliers, using tubing from his camelback as a tourniquet. Finally, after agonizing 3 hours, he freed himself and climbed out of the canyon, rappelled down a 60-foot sheer wall, and attempted to walk the 6 miles back to his car. A few miles in, he came across a family from the Netherlands who gave him food and water and alerted authorities. He was picked up by a helicopter 4 hours after amputating his arm. During the ordeal, he lost 40 pounds, including 25% of his blood volume. If he had amputated his arm earlier, he would have bled to death before escaping. But if he had not, his remains would still be in that canyon. Today, Aaron has 2 beautiful children, just like he envisioned in that hallucination that saved his life. He also continues to mountaineer and does not let the fear that this caused him hold him back in any way. U.S. Airways Flight 1549. On the afternoon of January 15, 2009, U.S. Airways Flight 1549 was scheduled to fly from New York City's LaGuardia Airport to Charlotte Douglas International Airport in Charlotte, North Carolina. It was being flown by experienced pilot Chelsea Sully Sullenberger and First Officer Jeffrey Skiles, with 150 passengers and 3 other crew members aboard. The flight was cleared for takeoff to the northeast from LaGuardia's runway 4 at 3 p.m. With Skiles in control, the crew made its first report, stating that the weather was unusually clear for that time of year, so much so that Sullenberger remarked to Skiles, "What a view of the Hudson today." But the mood on the aircraft would soon change, when about 1 minute later, the aircraft struck a flock of Canada geese head-on in a way that looked like a Hitchcock film. This impact caused engine failure moments later in both of the plane's engines, leading to a loss of thrust, causing the plane to suddenly be free-falling. Immediately, Sullenberger called in a mayday to New York Air Control. He asked the air controllers for landing options in New Jersey, mentioning Teterboro Airport, and permission was given for Teterborough's runway 1. Initially, the pilots responded, yes, but then, moments later, we can't do it. We're going to be in the Hudson. The aircraft passed less than 900 feet above the George Washington Bridge, with Sullenberger commanding over the cabin address system to brace for impact, with the flight attendants relaying the command to passengers. About 90 seconds later, the plane ditched into the Hudson River. Flight attendants compared the ditching to a hard landing, with one impact, no bounce, and then a gradual deceleration. The ebb tide then began to take the plane southward. Sullenberger opened the cockpit door and gave the order to evacuate. The crew then evacuated the passengers through the overwing exits, water entering through a hole in the fuselage, and the cargo doors that had come open. As the water rose, Doreen, the rear flight attendant, shouted to the passengers to climb over the seats. At this point, Doreen was up to her neck in water, but somehow, even with a severe laceration to her leg, made it to the front of the cabin to be evacuated after the passengers. Once everyone had been evacuated, Sullenberger walked the cabin twice to make sure nobody was left behind. Some evacuees waited for rescue, knee-deep in water on the partially submerged slides, with some wearing life vests. Others stood on the wings, or, fearing an explosion, swam away from the plane. Within 2 minutes, 2 ferries were there and began taking people aboard. About 140 New York City firefighters responded to nearby docks, as did police, helicopters, and various civilian vessels and divers. Other agencies provided medical help on the Weehawken side of the river, where most of the passengers were taken. The last person was taken from the plane at 3:55 p.m. Incredibly, the passengers and crew only suffered 95 minor and 5 serious injuries, with no fatalities. When Captain Sullenberger was asked how he executed such a perfect ditch that day, he said, "One way of looking at this might be that for 42 years, I've been making small, regular deposits in this bank of experience, education, and training. And on January 15th, the balance was sufficient so that I could make a very large withdrawal." Thanks to Sullenberger and Skiles' incredibly fast thinking and bravery, no lives were lost that day. Perhaps that's why this incident is now known as the Miracle on the Hudson.
Moro Prosperi. Imagine signing up for a race so brutal they literally call it the toughest foot race on earth. That's the Marathon des Sables, a 251-kilometer ultra-marathon through the Sahara Desert. And in 1994, Mauro Prosperi, a 38-year-old former Olympic pentathlete from Italy, decided he was going to run it. Couldn't be me, but to each their own, I guess. He found out about the race from a fellow runner and friend of 7 years, Giovanni Manzo. The idea sounded wild, but Prosperi wanted that. He trained like a madman, running 40 kilometers a day and even limiting his water on purpose to get used to dehydration. His wife was rightfully concerned, but she didn't stop him. The race kicked off on April 10th in Foums Guide, Morocco. Prosperi and Manzo started out together, part of a small group of about 80 runners. But because of the intense terrain and everyone's different pacing, runners quickly ended up isolated. You might start surrounded by people, but hours later, it's just you and the desert. By day 3, Prosperi and Manzo had already run 96 kilometers through salt flats, rock fields, and endless dunes. And they were doing it all with only what they could carry: a little bit of food, clothes, a compass, sleeping bag, emergency flare, and just enough water from checkpoints to survive. But what no one expected, though, to be honest, they probably should have, was the possibility of a sandstorm. And one was closing in fast. Prosperi would soon be alone, lost in one of the deadliest environments on Earth. By April 14th, during the 4th and longest stage of the race, he was actually doing incredibly well. He had already left his friend Manzo behind and was sitting in 4th place. That day's leg was over 85 kilometers, about 53 miles, and the heat was a blistering 115 degrees Fahrenheit, or 46 degrees Celsius. And the Sahara wasn't just hot, it was unstable. The sun beating down on the sand created rising waves of hot air that stirred up wind. Sand started lifting off the ground in huge clouds, cutting off visibility entirely. Prosperi couldn't see any other runners. He couldn't even see the trail, but instead of stopping, he just kept running. Later, he said, "When the sandstorm started to blow, I lost sight of everybody else. I kept running, though, because I thought I could see the trail. I was in 7th place and didn't want to lose my standing. It was nearly dark before the winds relented. I started running again, but After a few minutes, it occurred to me that I had lost the trail. By the time the storm cleared 8 hours later, Prosperi had run straight off the course. Sounds like me if I were to be in this race, honestly, even if there wasn't a sandstorm. But I digress. He had no idea where he was, and his face was bleeding from the wind-driven sand. His throat burned, and he could barely breathe. That night, he curled up under a bush, wrapped a towel over his face, and tried to survive the desert's freezing cold night. He had no clue that the worst was still ahead. The next morning, the winds were finally still. Prosperi woke up and did the only thing he knew how to do. He started running. For 4 more hours, he moved through the desert, convinced that if he just kept going, he'd find other runners. Maybe the trail, maybe someone. But when he climbed a tall dune to get a better view, all he saw was endless sand. The storm had wiped out all traces of the race route, and now his water was almost gone. Desperate to conserve what he had left, he tried sipping it as slowly as possible. But it wasn't enough. With no other choice, he began to drink his own urine. At this point, he remembered the race's emergency rule. So he stopped and waited. Hours passed. Then, just before sunset, a helicopter appeared in the sky. Prosperi thought it had to be for him, so he grabbed his emergency flare, aimed it upward, and fired. But the flare was too small, too dim in the desert sun. The helicopter flew right past him. It never even saw him. After the failed flare and in the endless silence of the desert, Prosperi realized he couldn't just sit and wait anymore. The sun was too strong, and he knew staying put would only lead to heat stroke. The next day, he started walking again, looking for shade or water. His compass was useless. Every direction looked the same, just sand and sky. But eventually, he saw something, a building in the distance. It turned out to be an old abandoned marabout shrine, an isolated Muslim structure where desert travelers sometimes rested, but this one was empty. Prosperi stayed there for the next few days, trying to stay alive. He rationed his food, cooking what little he had using urine on his portable burner. He sucked moisture from wet wipes, licked dew off rocks in the morning, and kept drinking his own urine. He climbed the roof of the shrine and planted a small Italian flag he had packed in his bag. If someone flew over, maybe they'd see it, and if he didn't survive, maybe it would let his family know where he had died. Inside the shrine's tower, he found bats. He used his pocket knife to kill them, drank their blood, and ate them raw. He also found bird eggs, beetles, and lizards nearby. Anything with moisture, he cooked and ate. On the 4th day of being lost, another plane flew overhead. Desperate to be seen, Prosperi traced the letters SOS in the sand. He lit a fire using the synthetic parts of his backpack to create a thick smoke, but just as the flames started to grow, another sandstorm hit. 12 more hours of total whiteout. Again, no one saw him. That night, something in him broke. He believed he was going to die, not just from starvation or thirst, but slowly, agonizingly. And worst of all, if he died lost in the desert, no one would find his body. In Italy, his home country, a missing person can't be declared dead for 10 years. His wife wouldn't get a pension. She'd have nothing. We made an agonizing decision. He took out a piece of charcoal and wrote a message to his family. Then, he used a pocket knife and tried to cut his wrists. But the cuts were shallow, and his body was so dehydrated that his blood had already started to clot. He didn't die. He woke up the next morning still alive, and something had changed. He decided to keep going. He left the shrine and started walking again, but only during the cooler hours of the early morning and late evening. During the day, he hid wherever he could, under trees, near cliffs, even burying himself in the sand to stay cool. He drank what little moisture there was from plant roots and kept eating snakes, lizards, whatever he could find. On the 8th day, he miraculously found an oasis. Water. At first, his throat was so swollen that he couldn't even swallow it. He threw up the first sips. But he stayed inside the puddle for hours, trying again and again until he could hold it down. The next morning, he filled his container and moved on. And later that day, he spotted something else. Fresh goat droppings. He followed the trail of the droppings, and he soon found human footprints. Then, on the other side of the dune, he saw her, a young Tuareg woman, tending to a herd of goats. He ran toward her, begging for help, but when she saw him, she screamed and ran. He vanished over the sand. Prospero didn't blame her. He looked at his reflection in the signal mirror. What stared back at him didn't look human. He was skeletal. His eyes were sunken deep into his skull. He later said, "I must be a hideous sight. I was appalled. I was a skeleton." But, amazingly, the girl came back. She brought her grandmother, who led him to a Berber tent in a nearby camp. There, a group of women tended to him. They gave him mint tea and a cup of goat's milk. It was the first real comfort he'd had in 9 days. The men of the tribe loaded him onto a camel and brought him to the nearest village. That's where things got complicated again. Local military police thought he might be a Moroccan spy, so they blindfolded him and took him to a military base for questioning. This guy could not get a break. But eventually, they figured out who he was. Prosperi was sent to a hospital in Tindouf. He had wandered about 181 miles off course, crossing the Jebel Bani mountain range and unknowingly passing from Morocco into Algeria. He stayed in the hospital for a week. One of the first things he did was call his wife, who had already assumed him dead. While he was lost, his family was working hard to find him. His brother and brother-in-law had flown in from Italy to help with the search. Marathon organizers, Moroccan military, and trackers were all out looking for him. They used Land Rovers and small aircraft. At one point, they even found the shrine he had stayed in and the signs he'd left behind, but by then they had assumed they were searching for a body. Prosperi survived, but barely. He had lost 30 pounds. Doctors had to give him 16 liters of fluids to rehydrate him. His liver was damaged, and for months afterwards, he could only eat soup and pureed food. His kidneys never fully recovered, and his legs continued to cramp for a year. It took him nearly 2 years to feel whole again. After his week in the Algerian hospital, he flew home to Rome. After learning of his plight, the Marathon des Sables changed its safety protocols. Runners now carry heavier distress flares, better suited for desert conditions. But for Prosperi, this wasn't the end of his story. He went back. Since his disappearance, he has returned to the Marathon des Sables 6 times, and in 2001, he even finished 13. He said that once he starts something, he has to finish it. And somehow, after everything, he still loves the desert. Feel a connection there, he said. I love the clarity, and you see, the Sahara spared my life. In a way, those days in the desert were my happiest. I'm not sure that if I was stuck lost in the desert for days, slowly dehydrating and starving to death, eating raw animals, that I would describe those as my happiest days. But I guess that's something I've never experienced, so I couldn't tell you how I'd truly react. Tsutsumo Yamaguchi. In August 1944, Tsutsumo Yamaguchi was in Hiroshima on a business trip, while his home and family were in Nagasaki. You might be able to see where this is going. He was a marine engineer, and he'd been in Hiroshima for 3 months, helping with a ship design project. On the morning of August 6th, he was finally ready to head home. He was walking to the train station with 2 coworkers when he realized he had forgotten his hanko, a personal stamp used as identification in Japan, so he turned around to get it. At 8:15 a.m., as he was walking back toward the docks, he saw a bomber flying overhead. It was the Enola Gay. He saw 2 small parachutes drop, then a blinding flash of light, and the sky exploded. Yamaguchi was about 3 kilometers from ground zero. The blast ruptured his eardrums, temporarily blinded him, and burned the entire left side of his upper body. But despite his injuries, he lived. He crawled to a shelter, rested, and then searched for his colleagues. Miraculously, they had also made it. That night, the 3 of them stayed together in an air raid shelter. The next morning, through the chaos, Yamaguchi returned to Nagasaki, thinking that the worst of it was over. He was covered in burns and wrapped in bandages, but he was home. On August 9th, just 3 days later, he went back to work. And that morning, at 11 a.m., he was ironically describing what had happened in Hiroshima to a coworker when the second bomb fell. Again, Yamaguchi was about 3 kilometers from the blast, and again, he survived. But he was in worse shape. His wounds couldn't be rebandaged. He developed a high fever and vomited for days. He lost hearing in his left ear, and all of his hair fell out. But against all odds, he survived. He got better. Yamaguchi went on to raise a family and eventually led a fully healthy life. He became a passionate voice against nuclear weapons. Later, he would marry a fellow survivor of the Nagasaki bombing. His daughter later recalled that he was constantly wrapped in bandages until she was 12 years old. Unfortunately, in his final years, the radiation did catch up with him. He developed cataracts and then leukemia. In 2010, Tsutomu Yamaguchi died of stomach cancer. He was 93 years old. He is the only person officially recognized by the Japanese government as having survived both atomic bombings, which in my opinion had to make him the greatest player of two truths and a lie of all time. Beck Weathers. Beck Weathers is an American mountain climber who, in May of 1996, was one of 8 clients being guided up Mount Everest by Rob Hall. Weathers, who had recently had a radiochorotomy surgery on his eyes, soon discovered that he was blinded by the effects of high altitude. Not exactly a good thing to realize when you are literally climbing the tallest mountain on Earth. On May 10th, the two had planned to reach the summit, but when Hall found out that Weathers couldn't see, he wanted him to go back to Camp 4 immediately. Weathers, however, believed his vision might improve when the sun came out, so Hall advised him to wait on the balcony, 27,000 feet high on the 29,000 foot tall Everest, until Hall could come back down and descend with him. However, Hall never returned. He had been caught in the blizzard now known as the 1996 Mount Everest disaster, and sadly, he didn't make it. With the blizzard getting worse by the minute, Weathers knew he needed to descend the mountain if he wanted to survive, so, with no other choice, he began descending with another guide and his group. But the storm proved too formidable, and Weathers and 10 other climbers became disoriented in the storm, and they couldn't find Camp 4. By the time there was a break in the storm several hours later, Weathers had been so weakened that he and 4 others in the group had to be left behind by the rest of the group so they could summon help. When another guide appeared to rescue them, Weathers was gone, seemingly having stood up and disappeared in the night. Nobody knows exactly why he left, but finally, after 2 days alone in hypothermic temperatures, an expedition found him together with another climber, Yasuko Namba. Both climbers were found to be alive, but they were in an extreme state of stupor. Believing the climbers to be near death and unable to make it off the mountain alive, the rescuers left them and returned to Camp 4, making this the 3rd time Weathers had been left behind on the mountain. But, unexpectedly, Weathers emerged from his hypothermic coma. When he awoke, he somehow managed to walk down to Camp 4 under his own power. When he arrived, other climbers said that his frozen hand and nose looked and felt as if they were made of porcelain. They didn't expect him to survive. His hands were so frozen that one of the surgeons who later operated on them described them as the hands of a dead man. With that assumption, they only tried to make him comfortable until he died, but he managed to survive another freezing night alone in the tent, unable to eat, drink, or keep himself covered with the sleeping bags. His cries for help could not be heard above the blizzard, and his companions were surprised to find him alive and coherent the following day. Weathers was later helped to walk on frozen feet to a lower camp, where he was subject to one of the highest altitude medical evacuations ever performed. Following his helicopter evacuation, his right arm was amputated between the elbow and wrist. All 4 fingers and his thumb on his other hand were amputated, as well as parts of both feet. His nose was amputated but reconstructed with tissue from his ear and forehead. He lost a few limbs, but somehow he survived. Today, Weathers continues to practice medicine and deliver motivational speeches. His book, Left for Dead, My Journey Home from Everest, was published in 2000 and proved to be a commercial success. He even occasionally climbs. Jesus Vidania. Jesus Vidania is a fisherman from Mexico with 2 friends named Lucio Rondon and Salvador Ordonez. Together, they set out with 2 other hired men to catch sharks south of Isla Maria in a 28-foot fiberglass boat. However, they quickly exhausted their fuel, and strong easterly winds cast them adrift in the North Equatorial Current, which crosses the Pacific Ocean from Mexico to the Philippines. Though a search was launched by Rondon's family, the castaways were blown out into the high seas too quickly and just could not be found. And without a radio, the fishermen were unable to call for help. Despite this, the men fought to stay alive. They collected rainwater in empty gasoline containers, but had no way of accessing food. The group of men just lived, adrift in the middle of the ocean like this for 2 months, but with the onset of winter, the 2 hired men tragically passed away due to starvation. Although the men believed they were drifting aimlessly, the survivors had accidentally followed exactly the same path that the Nao de China traveled in the 17th century. Just when they feared all hope was lost, they saw planes flying from the west and came to the realization that they might actually be closer to land in the west rather than the east. They decided it would be easier to head that way than continue attempting to travel east back to Mexico. They fashioned a sail with blankets and continued westwards, following the wind and the currents. Over the next 270 days, their average speed was 2.5 miles per hour. Over time, the men knew they needed food. They fashioned fishing hooks with string and wire from the engine and managed to catch turtles by diving into the ocean with a rope tied to their waists. They even ate the bones and drank the blood of these turtles. It was all they had. Slowly but surely, they continued west for another agonizing 9 months. On August 9, 2006, their boat was spotted on the radar of a Taiwanese tuna fishing vessel, the Cruise 102, at a distance of 20 miles. Intrigued by the unexpected signal and thinking it had to be bigger than just a group of seagulls, the captain ordered the crew to sail towards it. Soon, they reached the stranded boat. Finding the men to be, quote, very hungry but otherwise healthy, they took them aboard at 2 p.m. local time. They gave the men food, medical care, and clothes, and headed towards the closest land, the Marshall Islands, 200 miles to the east. On the 13-day journey there, the men rested and regained their strength. When they disembarked on August 22, 2006, touching land for the first time in nearly 10 months, they were taken to local authorities. They were put in contact with the Mexican embassy in New Zealand, who arranged to have them flown home to Mexico. They finally arrived home on August 27, 2006, and reunited with their families. And the next day, amazingly, shockingly even, they went back to the original port they left on to continue shark fishing. Yume Yazalin, Jesus Vidania's 21-year-old wife, was pregnant when her husband got lost at sea. When he returned, the baby had already been born. The miracle of the Andes. The Old Christians Club rugby union team from Montevideo, Uruguay, were scheduled to play a match in Santiago, Chile against the Old Boys Club. The Uruguayan club president, Daniel Juan, chartered an Air Force plane to fly the team over the Andes Mountains. There wound up being 10 extra seats on the flight, so the team invited friends and family members to come along. The aircraft carried 40 passengers total, and on the day of the accident was being flown by Colonel Julio Cesar Ferradas and co-pilot Lieutenant Colonel Dente Hector Lagurara. The aircraft departed Carrasco International Airport on October 12, 1972, but a storm front over the Andes forced them to spend the night in Mendoza, Argentina, to wait for weather conditions to improve. Although there is a direct path from Mendoza to Santiago, the high mountains were nearly the height of the aircraft's service ceiling. With the plane filled to capacity, this would have required the pilots to fly very carefully to avoid the mountains, so they decided to take a well-known, longer, U-shaped route that planes of that size normally took to minimize the danger. On the morning of October 13th, the weather had still not improved, further delaying the flight. But the plane eventually took off at 2:13 p.m. After crossing the Andes into Chile, the aircraft was supposed to turn north and initiate their descent into Pujol Airport in Santiago. Pilot Ferradas had previously flown across the Andes 29 times, but on this flight he was training his co-pilot Lagurara, who was at the controls. Following future events, this would widely become regarded as a bad move. As they flew above the Andes, clouds obscured the mountains below. Due to this, the pilots were flying based on the instruments inside the plane alone and could not visually confirm their location from the mountains below. At 3:21 p.m., shortly after crossing Planchon Pass, Lagurara notified air traffic controllers that he expected to reach Curacao a minute later, but this was incorrect. Unable to see the plane's actual location, he should have been using the airplane's radio navigation system, but for unknown reasons, he did not see the radio displaying the distance to Curaçao's radio beacon, still 40 miles due west. The flight time from Planchon Pass to Curaçao is normally 11 minutes, but only 3 minutes later, the co-pilot radioed Santiago that they were overflying Curaçao and turning due north. He requested permission from air traffic control to descend. The controller authorized the aircraft to descend to 11,500 feet, unaware due to lack of radar coverage that the airplane was still flying over the Andes. Pilot Ferradas also failed to notice the navigation error. As the plane descended, it encountered severe turbulence. Something was wrong, but they didn't know what yet. At first, the rugby players joked about the turbulence until they saw that they were abnormally close to the mountains. While neither pilot survived to tell their story, Nando Parado, a rugby player, later stated, "That was probably the moment when the pilots saw the black ridge rising dead ahead." Realizing their mistake all too late, the pilots pulled up and the plane began to climb until it was nearly vertical and shook violently. The ground collision alarm sounded. A crash was imminent. The plane struck the mountain 2 or 3 times. While it may never be known exactly how these collisions transpired, evidence from the crash site indicates that the lower part of the tail cone may have clipped the ridge. The second collision ripped the right wing off, and some evidence suggests it was ripped off with such force that that's what caused the tail cone to tear off. When it did so, it took with it the rear part of the plane, including 2 rows of seats and the baggage hold, leaving a gaping hole in the back of the plane. 3 passengers, the navigator, and a singular flight attendant were lost with the tail section. The aircraft's momentum and its remaining engine carried it forward and upward until a rock outcropping tore off the left wing. Its propeller sliced through the fuselage. During this time, 2 more passengers fell out of the back of the plane. Finally, the nose of the plane crashed into the snow and careened down the slope of the glacier, rammed into a snowbank, and came to a stop. The stop was so sudden that the remaining seats broke loose and pushed the passengers into the front of the plane. Pilot Ferradas died instantly when the instrument panel compressed his chest and forced his head out of the windshield. Co-pilot Laguarara was critically injured and trapped in the crushed cockpit. He asked one of the passengers to find his pistol and shoot him, but the passengers refused. He died the following day. The plane's fuselage had come to rest in the cirque of the Glacier de la Lagrima, or the Glacier of Tears, aptly named. 33 passengers and crew had survived the initial crash, but many were seriously injured. Most had broken legs resulting from the impact of the seats at the front of the plane. 2 players, Canessa and Gustavo, who were medical students, quickly began treating the wounded. Nando Parado had a skull fracture and remained unconscious for 3 days. His sister, Susanna, was badly injured and semi-conscious. Graziella Mariani's legs were broken and trapped by twisted seats, and Enrique Platero had a piece of metal stuck in his abdomen, and when his teammates removed it, it took a piece of intestine with it. Despite his injuries, he began helping the fellow survivors as well. The Chilean Air Search and Rescue Service was notified within the hour that the flight was unaccounted for. They began to search in the Curacao corridor, the last reported position of the plane, but this position was incorrect, and unbeknownst to the passengers or the search teams, the flight had crashed in Argentina even before crossing into Chile. Luckily, the search area was expanded far enough that the planes did fly over the crash site. Less luckily, none of them spotted it. The survivors tried to use lipstick recovered from their luggage to write an SOS message on the roof, but they didn't have enough lipstick to make large enough letters that could be seen from the air by rescuers. They also used luggage to fashion a cross in the snow. The survivors saw aircraft fly over the crash site on 3 different occasions, but the rescuers were unable to spot the white fuselage against the snow. The harsh winter conditions gave the rescuers little hope that they would find any survivors. After 8 days of searching, rescue efforts were canceled when searchers concluded that the chances of anyone surviving the crash were 0. They planned to resume their search and recover bodies at the end of winter when the snow melted, unknowingly leaving the 33 survivors stuck in the frigid air. By the second day, 5 more of the survivors died due to their injuries, including co-pilot Laguarara. The remaining 28 survivors used luggage, seats, and snow to close off the rear end of the fuselage, fashioning an 8 by 10-foot shelter from the snow. Fido Strauch devised a solar-powered water collector with sheet metal he retrieved from under the seats. This was vital in keeping the team alive. They used the woolen seat covers to keep warm and seat cushions as snowshoes. On the 9th day of surviving this way, Susana Parado died due to her injuries, adding another to the death toll and leaving only 27 survivors remaining. The rugby team had a hard time with the cold, especially when temperatures reached -22 degrees Fahrenheit or -30 degrees Celsius at night.
They had all lived their entire lives by the sea, and some of them had never even seen snow before the crash. After days of just surviving and tending the wounded, they managed to find an AM transitor radio. Roy Hartley improvised a long antenna using electrical wire from the plane, and on the 11th day, they heard the news that their search had been called off. Piers Paul Redd's book, Alive, The Story of the Andes Survivors, describes how they reacted. The others, who had clustered around Roy upon hearing the news, began to sob and pray, all except Parado, who looked calmly up at the mountains which rose to the west. Gustavo Nikolic came out of the aircraft and, seeing their faces, knew what they had heard. He climbed through the hole in the wall of suitcases and rugby shirts, crouched at the mouth of the dim tunnel, and looked at the mournful faces looking at him. "Hey, boys," he shouted. "There's some good news we just heard on the radio. They've called off the search." Inside the crowded aircraft, there was silence. As the hopelessness of the predicament enveloped them, they wept. "Why the hell is that good news?" Pace shouted angrily. "Because it means," Nikolic said, "that we're going to get out of here on our own." The survivors had very little food to eat. They found 8 chocolate bars, 3 small jars of jam, a tin of mussels, a tin of almonds, a few dates, some candies, and several bottles of wine. They rationed the meager supply of food, but it only lasted a week. With no other choice, they ate the stuffing from the seats and leather from the belts, but that made them sick. Soon, that supply ran out as well. Now knowing that rescue efforts had been called off and facing certain death from starvation, they gave each other permission to use their bodies for food in the case that they died. After days without food and left with no other alternative, they began to eat the bodies of their deceased friends and relatives. At first, they were so disgusted by the experience that they could only eat skin, muscle, and fat, but in the end, they also ate hearts, lungs, and even brains. A team member, Canessa, later described the decision to eat the dead. "Our common goal was to survive, but what we lacked was food. We had long since run out of the meager pickings we'd found on the plain, and there was no vegetation or animal life to be found. After just a few days, we had the sensation that our own bodies were consuming themselves just to remain alive. Before long, we would become too weak to recover from starvation. We knew the answer, but it was just too terrifying to contemplate. The bodies of our friends and teammates preserved outside in the snow and ice contained the vital, life-preserving proteins that would keep us alive. But could we do it? For a long time, we agonized. I went out in the snow and prayed to God for guidance. Without his consent, I felt I would be violating the memory of my friends, that I would be stealing their souls. We wondered whether we were going mad to even contemplate such a deed. Had we turned into brute savages? Or was this the only alternative for us to survive? Truly, we were pushing the limits of our fear. All the eventual survivors did end up consuming human meat. But the survivors' trials were not yet over. Close to midnight on October 29th, and 16 days after the crash, an avalanche struck the fuselage while the survivors were asleep, almost completely filling it with snow and smothering 8 more people to death. The fuselage was completely buried, filling it to within 3 feet of the ceiling. Trapped inside, the team quickly realized that they would soon run out of air. Thankfully, Parado was able to take a metal pole from the luggage rack and pry open one of the cockpit windscreens, poking a hole in the snow for fresh air. On October 31st, they were able to dig an exit tunnel from the cockpit to the surface, only to be faced with a blizzard so severe that they crawled back into the fuselage. As the days and weeks passed, the temperature rose and the snow that had once buried them began to melt away. Arturo Nogueira died on November 15th, and 3 days later, Rafael Echeverren also died, both from infected wounds. Numa Turcati, whose extreme revulsion against eating human flesh left him starved, died on day 60, December 11th. Slowly losing more and more of their team, the remaining survivors knew they would all die if they did not leave soon and get help. Eventually, the decision was made for a few survivors to leave on an expedition to get help. 3 men, Canessa, Parado, and Vizintin, were chosen for the expedition as they were the most physically fit. They were allocated larger rations of meat to build their strength for the expedition and the warmest clothes to withstand the nighttime cold. The expedition left on November 15th and aimed to head west to Chile, but the large mountain on the western rim of the glacier cirque was deemed to be too much of an obstacle, so they headed east. They hoped the valley would eventually turn west and lead them to Chile.
After several hours of walking downhill east of the fuselage, they found the tail section of the aircraft, mostly intact. They also found luggage with a box of chocolates, 3 meat patties, a bottle of rum, some Coca-Cola, cigarettes, extra clothes, comic books, a bit of medicine, and most importantly, the aircraft's batteries. They decided to seek shelter for the night inside the tail section, started a fire to stay warm, and stayed up late reading the comic books. Knowing these items would be crucial in helping those back at the fuselage, they returned. They also wanted to bring the batteries back to power the radio and make an SOS call to Santiago, but found the 53-pound batteries were too heavy to carry back uphill in the deep snow. They decided it would be easier to disconnect the radio and bring it to the tail section. Once they returned, they told the team of their plan and disconnected said radio. Unbeknownst to them, the batteries did not have enough voltage to power the radio, dooming their plan from the start. After several days of not being able to make the radio work, they gave up and returned to the fuselage, realizing they truly would have to climb out of the mountains themselves to get help. So they set out once again. On December 12, 1972, Parado, Canessa, and Vizintin began climbing out of the glacier. Instead of climbing the somewhat lower ridge to the south, they headed straight up the steep 30 to 60 degree slope of the mountain ridge. The climb was slow and tedious, the air thin, and snow so deep it sometimes reached their waists, making it all the more agonizing. The survivors at the fuselage watched them climb for 3 long days. On the third morning after starting out, Canessa stayed back at their campsite. Vizintin and Parado reached the base of a nearly vertical 100-meter wall. It was covered with snow and ice. Parado used a stick he brought along to carve steps in the ice wall. When he reached the top, he believed he would see the green valleys of Chile to the west, but was stunned when he was faced with seemingly unending snow-capped mountain peaks extending in every direction. Discouraged, Vizintin and Parado descended and rejoined Canessa as the sun set. They sipped cognac from a bottle they had found in the tail section of the aircraft, and Parado said, "Roberto, can you imagine how beautiful this would be if we were not walking dead?" They realized their rescue-seeking expedition was going to take much longer than they had anticipated. Coming to the conclusion that they only had enough food for 2 of them to continue, Vizintin returned to base camp on a makeshift sled, arriving back within an hour. Which, again, probably would have been kind of fun to go down if it wasn't such a horrible situation. From their shelter the night before, Parado and Canessa took 3 hours to climb the ridge. When they reached the top once again, they only saw snow-capped mountains in every direction. Even having heard this to be so from his companions the night before, Canessa exclaimed, "We're dead!" But Parado told Canessa, "We may be walking to our deaths, but I would rather walk to meet my death than wait for it to come to me." Canessa agreed. "You and I are friends, Nando. We have been through so much. Now let's go die together." They could see 2 lower peaks near the horizon that were clear of snow, with the valley at the foot of this mountain slowly winding its way towards them. Parado was sure that this valley would be the way out of the mountains and refused to give up hope. Parado and Canessa hiked down for 7 more days into Chile. Finally, they reached the valley where they found the source of Rio San Jose. Emboldened by this find, they continued descending along the river and reached the snow line. Slowly but surely, they started seeing more signs of human life, and on the 9th day, they even found some cows. That night, Canessa was exhausted and unable to keep walking, so they rested for the evening. As they gathered wood for a fire, they saw 3 men on horseback on the other side of the river. Parado called out to them, but the noise of the river made it impossible to communicate. One of the men across the river saw Parado and Canessa and shouted back, "Tomorrow!" At this point, all the men could do was wait and hope the other men would truly come back. The next day, the man thankfully returned, scribbled a note, tied the note with a pencil to a stone, and threw the stone across the river to Parado. Parado replied, "I come from an airplane that crashed in the mountains. I am Uruguayan. We have been walking for 10 days. I have a wounded friend up there. In the plane, there are still 14 injured people. We need to get out of here quickly, and we don't know how to. We don't have any food. We are very weak. When are you going to come get us, please? We can't even walk. Where are we?" Sergio Catalan, a Chilean arriero, read the note and made signs that he understood. He remembered that several weeks ago an acquaintance had asked if he had heard about the airplane that had crashed into the Andes, and he could not imagine that anyone would still be alive from that. Still, he threw a loaf of bread to the men across the river and rode due west for 10 hours to get help. During this trip, he ran into another arriero and asked him to ride back to the men and take them to the Los Matienes village. Catalan then followed the river to its junction with another, crossed a bridge, and followed the narrow route to the holiday resort of Termas del Flaco. There, he hailed a truck that took him to the police station at the village of Puente Negro, where the police relayed the news of the survivors to the Chilean army, who in turn notified the army headquarters in Santiago. In the meantime, Parado and Canessa arrived on horseback at Los Matienes, where they were fed and finally able to rest on a bed. Canessa had lost half of his body weight since the plane crash and weighed only 97 pounds. Immediately upon hearing the news, the government went into action. The Chilean Air Force provided 3 helicopters to assist with the rescue. They flew in heavy cloud cover to Los Matienes, where the army interviewed Parada and Canessa. They were shocked to hear of the other survivors still waiting for rescue on the mountain. Once the fog lifted at noon, Parado guided the helicopters to the crash site in Argentina with the pilot's map he had brought with him. One of the helicopters remained behind with them as backup. During the flight to retrieve the survivors, the pilots were astounded at the difficult terrain Parado and Canessa had traversed to get help. The 2 helicopters arrived at the crash site on the afternoon of December 22, 1972. The steep terrain only permitted the pilot to touch down with a single skid, but that did not stop them. However, due to the weight limits on the crafts, the initial rescue could only take half of the survivors. After it departed, the 8 remaining survivors spent one last night on the mountain, accompanied by 4 rescuers who volunteered to stay behind with them. As day broke on December 23rd, the last remaining survivors were rescued, having spent 72 days in the wilderness. Michalina Lewandowska. It was a chilly day on December 5, 2011 in Huddersfield, United Kingdom, but Michalina Lewandowska didn't mind. She was happy with her fiancé, Marcin Kasprak, and loved her 3-year-old son, Jacob, very much. But she had no idea just how quickly things could go wrong. When Marcin came home from work that night, Michalina was preparing to go grocery shopping. After hugging her son goodbye, she turned to the door to leave when she was suddenly zapped by a 30,000-volt taser gun, rendering her unconscious. When she awoke, she was bound and gagged with duct tape and forced inside a cardboard box. In complete darkness, all she could hear was the sound of dirt slowly piling up on top of her. Her fiancé, the person she trusted most in the world, was burying her alive. In her panic, Michalina found a small hole in the box, but later recalled, "He was putting the soil on top of me. I wanted to reply. I wanted to put my 2 fingers to the hole, but I was afraid if he could see it, he may break my fingers with the shovel," she said. When she finally heard his footsteps receding, she was buried under 6 inches of dirt with an 88-pound tree branch laid on top. Lying in a shallow grave, Michalina was worried that her life was over. But the thought of her son kept her pushing through. After around 30 minutes of suffering in silence, accepting her death, in a stroke of genius, she used the very engagement ring that Marcin had given her to cut the tape off of her arms and legs, and then cut the box, widening the small hole enough to stick her hand through, and then eventually her head. By the time her head had emerged, dirt was flowing into the box and she needed to escape quickly for fear of suffocation. Thankfully, her assailant had been short-sighted and made the grave shallow enough that she was able to pull herself completely out. After her daring escape, she stumbled to the road where she alerted a passing motorist to her plight, who took her home and called the authorities. Other than being dazed, she was unharmed. She had lived through many people's worst nightmare. By the end of that month, Marcin Kasprak was found guilty of attempted murder, despite telling the court he only meant to scare Lewandowska and did not intend to kill her. He was sentenced to 20 years in prison, which is far too short if you ask me. Alcides Moreno. Alcides Moreno and his brother Edgar were Ecuadorian immigrants working as window washers in New York City. On December 7, 2007, the brothers took an elevator to the roof of Salo Tower, a 47-story apartment building on the Upper East Side. They stepped onto the 16-foot-long, 3-foot-wide aluminum scaffolding designed to slowly lower them down the black glass of the building. Instead of keeping the brothers safe, the anchors holding the 1,250-pound platform instead gave way, plunging it and them 472 feet down to the alley below. Edgar, the younger brother, tumbled off the scaffolding, hit the top of a wooden fence, and was killed instantly. But when paramedics arrived, miraculously, Alcides was found sitting up among the wreckage, still alive and conscious. They rushed him to New York Presbyterian Hospital 4 blocks away. Doctors say that he was even still conscious when entering the emergency room. He was given roughly 24 pints of blood and 19 pints of plasma and underwent an operation to open his abdomen in the emergency room because his doctor said, "We did not want to risk moving him into an operating room." He was induced into a coma. He had sustained severe injuries to his brain, spinal column, chest, and abdomen, and had fractures to his ribs, right arm, and both legs. As December went on, he endured 9 more orthopedic operations. During his time in the hospital, Alcides' wife, Rosario, spent many hours next to him. She would lift his hand repeatedly and stroke her own face, hoping that the simple movement would remind him of what he had, would bring him back. Then, on Christmas Day, Alcides Moreno reached out and stroked the wrong face. Apparently, he tried to do it to one of the nurses, Rosario said. I looked at him and I said, "You're not supposed to do that. I'm your wife. You touch your wife." And for the first time since the accident, he spoke. He turned around and said, "What did I do?" Alcides was once again conscious, and amazingly, he could speak. After that, he underwent 2 more surgeries before entering long months of rehabilitation. Despite all odds, he made a full recovery. Above 10 stories, most of the time we never see the patients because they usually go to the morgue, Dr. Berry said. This is right up there with those anecdotes of people falling out of airplanes and surviving. People whose parachutes don't open and somehow they manage to survive. We're talking about tiny, tiny percentages, well under 1% of people who fall that distance and survive, let alone make a full recovery. Nobody is entirely sure how Alcides managed to survive while his brother died instantly, but one official noted that Edgar's body was found partially under the platform. Dr. Berry also noticed that Alcides miraculously did not injure his head too badly. Because Alcides does not actually remember the fall, we may never know what truly led to his miraculous survival. 7 years after the accident, the New York Post reported that he was now living in Phoenix, Arizona, drives his kids to school and sports matches, works at a gym, and even completed a 3-mile walk for his church's food pantry. Leonid Rozagov. The 6th Soviet Antarctic expedition took place from September 1960 to October 1962. Leonid Rozagov was a Russian surgeon and the sole doctor on a team of 15 men. The expedition was going smoothly, but on the morning of April 29, 1961, Rozagov experienced general weakness, nausea, and moderate fever, as well as pain in the lower right portion of his abdomen. By April 30th, signs of appendicitis became apparent, and his condition worsened considerably by the evening. The nearest other Soviet research station was over 1,000 miles away, and stations from other countries did not have aircraft available to transport him. And even if they had, the severe blizzard conditions would have prevented them from landing anyway. With little choice, and knowing his condition had the potential to decline rapidly, Leonid decided to remove his own appendix. He completed the operation with the help of a driver and meteorologist, who provided instruments and held a mirror so Rozagov could observe areas not easily visible on his own body. Rozagov laid semi-reclined and half-turned to his left side. Novocaine was used for local anesthetic. Rozagov made a 12-centimeter incision of his abdominal wall and exposed the appendix. While doing this, he accidentally cut his intestine and had to suture it shut before continuing. About 35 minutes into the operation, he began to feel weak and nauseous, but he pushed through, taking several short pauses to rest. He successfully removed his own appendix, applied local antibiotics, and closed himself up. The operation took a total of about 2 hours. After the surgery, gradual improvement in Rozagov's symptoms and general conditions occurred. His body temperature returned to normal after 5 days, and the stitches were removed 7 days after the operation. He resumed his regular duties in about 2 weeks. He completed the expedition, and in 1961, he was awarded the Order of the Red Banner of Labor. In October 1962, he returned to Leningrad, where he continued to practice medicine until his death in 2000, aged 66 years old. Timothy Lancaster. Tim Lancaster was a 42-year-old pilot who worked for British Airways and had logged over 11,500 flight hours. On June 10, 1990, he was captain of British Airways Flight 5390 from Birmingham, England to Malaga Airport in Spain. He was flying with co-pilot Alistair Aitchison. Aitchison handled a routine takeoff at 8:20 a.m. local time and then handed control to Lancaster as the plane continued to climb. Both pilots released their shoulder harnesses and Lancaster loosened his lap belt. At 8:33, the plane had climbed to about 17,300 feet and the cabin crew were preparing for meal service. It was at this time that flight attendant Nigel Ogden entered the cockpit and heard a loud bang. Never a good sign on an aircraft. The left windshield panel on Lancaster's side of the flight deck had separated from the forward fuselage, and within seconds he was propelled out of his seat by the rushing air from the decompression and forced headfirst out of the cockpit. Amazingly, his knees got caught on the flight controls, but this meant that his lower body was still inside the aircraft, while his upper torso was outside, exposed to extreme wind and cold. Due to the stress this decompression put on the aircraft, the autopilot disengaged, causing the plane to descend rapidly. The flight deck door was blown inward onto the control console, blocking the throttle control and causing the aircraft to gain speed as it descended. Flight documents and checklists were blown out of the cockpit, and debris blew in from the passenger cabin. Ogden rushed to grab Lancaster's belt and keep him inside the plane. He attempted to pull him all the way back in, but the force of the rushing air was too great. The plane was not equipped with enough oxygen for everyone on board, so Aitchison began a rapid emergency descent to reach an altitude with sufficient air pressure, with Lancaster still hanging out of the front of the plane. After reaching an altitude the crew and passengers could breathe at, he re-engaged autopilot and broadcast a distress signal, but was unable to hear any response due to the wind. Ogden, who was still holding on to Lancaster, was becoming exhausted, so Chief Steward John Heward and Flight Attendant Simon Rogers took over the task of holding on to the captain. By this time, Lancaster had shifted several centimeters further outside, and his head was repeatedly striking the side of a fuselage, a terrifying and morbid sound. The crew believed him to be dead, but Aitchison told the others to continue holding on to him, out of fear that letting go of him might cause him to strike the left wing, engine, or horizontal stabilizer, potentially damaging it and causing a catastrophic crash. Eventually, Aitchison was able to hear the clearance from air traffic control to make an emergency landing at Southampton Airport. The flight attendants somehow managed to free Lancaster's ankles from the flight controls while still keeping a hold of him. At 8:15, the aircraft landed at Southampton and the passengers disembarked using boarding steps. Lancaster was carefully removed from the windshield, unconscious but shockingly alive. He was taken to a local hospital but only suffered from non-life-threatening injuries: frostbite, bruising, shock, and fractures to his right arm, left thumb, and right wrist. Ogden had frostbite on his face, a dislocated shoulder, and later suffered from post-traumatic stress disorder. There were no other injuries. In the aftermath of the incident, it was determined that the windshield portion, which had only been installed 27 hours ago, was installed with the wrong screws. The undersized screws were unable to withstand the force of flight due to the air pressure difference between the cabin and the outside atmosphere. Despite this experience, Lancaster returned to work after fewer than 5 months. He left British Airways in 2003 and flew with EasyJet until he retired from commercial piloting in 2008. Aitchison left British Airways shortly after the accident and joined Channel Express, flying for them until he made his last commercial flight on the day of his 65th birthday in June 2015. Ogden returned to work but subsequently suffered from severe PTSD and retired in 2001 on grounds of ill health. As of 2005, he was reported to be working as a night watchman at a Salvation Army hospital. Fabrice Muamba. Fabrice Muamba is a Congolese-born English former professional footballer who played for Arsenal, Birmingham City, and the Bolton Wanderers as a central midfielder. Born in Zaire, Muamba moved to England at the age of 11 and subsequently played for England up to the under-21 level. On March 17, 2012, Muamba suffered a heart attack and collapsed during the first half of an FA Cup quarter-final match between the Bolton and Tottenham Hotspur. After receiving lengthy attention on the pitch from medical personnel, including a consulted cardiologist, Dr. Andrew Diener, who happened to be at the game as a fan, Muamba was taken to the specialist coronary care unit at the London Chest Hospital. He received multiple defibrillator shocks, both on the field and in the ambulance, but during this time, his heart had stopped for a total of 78 minutes. The match was abandoned, and Bolton's next game, 3 days later, was also postponed. When Muamba arrived at the hospital, his heart was, incredibly, beating, but very faintly.
He was kept under anesthesia in an intensive care unit, and his heart was kept beating by medication. But by March 19th, 2 days later, his heart was beating without that medication, and he was able to move his limbs. He was also able to recognize family members and respond appropriately to questions. By March 21st, his consultant stated that Mwamba's progress had exceeded their expectations, and that although he had faced a lengthy recovery period, normal life was within the spectrum of possibility. 2 weeks after the incident, a photograph was released of Mwamba sitting up in his hospital bed and smiling. He was discharged from the hospital on April 16th, having been fitted with a pacemaker. Despite having been dead for 78 minutes, he survived. He attended Bolton's home match against Tottenham Hotspur on May 2nd, where he expressed his gratitude for the support he received. On August 15, 2012, Bolton announced that Mwamba had retired from professional football based on the recommendation of his medical team. Though he never played another game, he did play 15 minutes in Ian Goodison's testimonial match in 2015 to a standing ovation. Following his retirement, he became a sports broadcaster, covering mostly African football, and continues doing that to this day. Harrison O'Keefe. Harrison O'Keefe was sitting on the toilet when a freak wave hit the tugboat he was working on and turned it upside down. Now he was on the floor and the toilet was above him. "I was just trying to open the door to get out when the toilet fell and hit me on the head," he says. He had just enough time to see blood pour from the wound before the lights went out. Everything was dark. The bathroom began to fill with water. It didn't take long, he says. 1 minute, 2 minutes, and he felt the boat touch the seabed. 100 feet below the surface, it came to rest. O'Keefe was 29 and working as a cook on the Jackson 4, a tugboat that was assisting an oil tanker about 20 miles off the coast of Nigeria. The tug had been helping to stabilize the tanker. O'Keefe had woken up that morning expecting it to be like any other day. He hadn't even gotten dressed yet and was wearing only his boxers. Water quickly began to fill the room, and panicking, he struggled to open the door. When he finally emerged, he had no idea which way he was facing. The ship was upside down, leaving him completely disoriented. In the hallway, he met 2 colleagues. There was a watertight door, which they attempted to use as an exit hatch, but it wouldn't budge. "I did not have the patience to wait," O'Keefe said. In a move that ran counter to every instinct, he turned away from the exit and swam further inside. As he swam away from the closed exit, the force of the water swept him into a different bathroom, one attached to the second engineer's cabin. The door was forced shut as he was swept in and the water level rose, but did not fill the room completely. He kept his head in the small pocket of air below the ceiling, which was, in reality, the floor, clinging to the base of the wash basin. Shut away in the dark, he heard his colleagues calling and crying. In a stroke of luck, the room he was in contained a life jacket which held a flashlight, meaning he was able to see in otherwise complete darkness. At this time, he still believed his best chance for survival was the exit hatch, so he ripped off a piece of a vent and tried to pry the bathroom door open. While he worked, the voices of his friends slowly faded, and he believed they had escaped. In reality, he was the only member of the crew who was still alive. When he finally managed to open the bathroom door, he returned to the watertight hatch to attempt to open it. Again and again over the following minutes and hours, he returned, swimming between the safety of his air pocket and the watertight door, but over time he realized that opening the door was impossible, so he turned his attention to staying alive in his air pocket. Searching through bags, he found a tin of sardines and a can of soda, which would come to be his only source of nutrition for the next 3 days. The water was very cold, so O'Keefe ripped the wooden panels from the ceiling and tied them together into a little raft. Now he could sit up there in his tiny air pocket and think of another way to escape the wreckage. He had consumed so much salt water while going between the air pocket and the sealed door that his throat ached and his tongue was beginning to peel. He ate the sardines and drank the cola, while crayfish made dinner out of his body. He could feel them biting his legs, torso, and arms, but he couldn't do anything about it. He thought of his mother and his wife. Stuck in complete sensory deprivation, as he did not want to waste the flashlight's batteries, he came to the conclusion that there was no way out of the ship. He decided that the best course of action was to just stay put. When a different sound, 3 days later, broke through the deafening silence, one that was far closer to him, O'Keefe had no idea that a diver had come to put a marker buoy on the vessel to warn other traffic of the wreck's location. but it gave him hope. He hammered on the side of the boat, trying to get a signal to the person outside. He had no idea how long it had been since the ship had sank. But eventually, he became aware of a tiny bubble of light in the darkness. He left his raft to try to find the source of the light, but failing, returned to his air pocket and looked back. This time, he saw the diver, swimming on a long umbilical. Video from the camera on the diver's helmet shows the moment that the diver saw O'Keen's pale palm floating in the water before him. The diver radios to base that he has found another body, and then...
Okay. All right, you found one, yeah? He's alive, he's alive. Okay, keep him there.
After the dive team realized that he was miraculously alive, O'Keen was brought to a recompression chamber where he would spend a further 3 days. He could not return to the surface immediately or he would have died from decompression sickness. Incredibly, when O'Keen's vital signs were measured, everything was normal. When he was finally back to the surface, against advice, he decided not to go to the hospital and immediately went home to see his wife. Physically, he was fine, but it soon became clear that he was suffering from intense PTSD from the incident. He suffered nightmares every night and even recalled once waking up and believing the house was sinking, so he picked up his wife and took her out the front door. In 2015, O'Keen and his wife separated due to mental health struggles, and O'Keen entered a depression. He decided that the only way to recover from this was to face his fears, and despite his brother warning against it, joined a deep-sea diving class. Today, O'Keen works as a diver, constructing and making repairs to oil facilities. He has a partner and 3 children. According to him, his experience underwater and his survival have changed his life in so many ways. The way I think, the way I see life, and yes, improved my life, actually, he says.
And there you have it, the first layer of the survivors of the Impossible Iceberg. I hope you enjoyed this video, and if you stuck around this long, please leave a like and feel free to subscribe because this is a long iceberg. There's going to be more videos. I seriously appreciate every viewer.